Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode. Great start of Games Up Podcast. My name is Cameron, and it's just me this week. Lewis is unable to record with me today for reasons. Let's be honest, I've forgotten. So we're going to do a very different, fairly light, fairly informal episode of the podcast today, because it's been a really pretty busy week in video games. The Overwatch League started their second season, and much has changed with that. If you're interested in our thoughts on it, we'll be publishing an article on World Geekly News this week, who bring you this podcast, worldgeeklynews.com. Go there and look at our thoughts on the Overwatch League. Additionally, Pokemon Go had their community day, and there was a new event announced. Apex Legends crossed 25 million players. Fortnite's been surprisingly quiet, hasn't it, in the wake of Apex. There's been some stuff announced, I think, or at least there's been some kind of continued community support like they always tend to do, but not quite the large response I would have expected from them. Very interesting. But of course, at the end of last week, on the 15th, all of the games ever released. After 5 years of what can only be described nicely, I think, as development hell, Crackdown 3 came out after 1 year, in fact less than that, since its last entry in the franchise. Far Cry New Dawn came out since, I think, a year and a half-ish since its announcement. Jump Force came out, and 2 years after its initial announcement, Metro Exodus came out. And generally, I think it's fair to say that whilst a lot of games came out of the gate swinging, it was a fairly mixed day for all of them. So this week we are going to discuss our thoughts on the kind of reactions to all of the games. We haven't had much opportunity to play them. I've personally been putting my time into Crackdown. Even if we did have access to all of the games, there's only me and Lewis, so we couldn't have played all of them. But we have been putting what time we can in, and so we're responding to kind of the community thoughts on them, the general gaming community thoughts on them, rather than our own thoughts. We don't have the time to make those thoughts up yet. But it was a really interesting day for releases, just to see which ones kind of fell, which ones failed, and which ones we thought would do better than they actually did. So let's begin with Crackdown. Crackdown, as I said, came after 5 years of what can only be described as development hell, and the game came out to pretty negative reviews across the board. It started off kind of looking at 5 out of 10s and has settled a little bit higher with the Metacritic score. And again, you should never trust Metacritic as a kind of actual way to rate games. It's a broken tool to do that with, but it does give you a good idea of the kind of overall falling of the critical analysis, even though you should read reviews and stuff. But the overall Metacritic score for Crackdown 3 is 6 out of 10, or 60%. 6 out of 10 is roughly where I thought the game would fall, maybe 6, 7 out of 10. But the community response has been a lot more mixed. Some people are totally done with it. They think it's repetitive and should be considerably better than it is after 5 years. There's a lot of talk of the technical downgrades that it's gone through and how the destruction systems are nowhere near what was promised when the game was revealed, while others have said it's a video game popcorn flick. It's fairly insubstantive, and that I will give you. There's very little story, and what story there is not the highlight here. But the gameplay is pretty strong, and I've got to say, I agree with them. I've put about 15 hours into Crackdown at this point, considering it came out a day and a half before this podcast was recorded. I'd say that's not bad, and I'm willing to start making an opinion on it, and I kind of really love it. But I recognise its flaws, hugely so. The story is absolutely trash. Fine trash, totally, like, it allows you to go out and play the game. Trash. It's not going to get in the way of that trash, but it is trash. The game looks pretty, but it is nowhere near what was promised, even if what we were shown in those original tech demos was a giant vertical slice. It's a shame that we're not a little bit closer to it than we in fact are. But the gameplay systems and mechanics feel pretty tight, to be honest. The shooting is not difficult, but very satisfying within that lack of difficulty. The constant upgrading and the platforming that comes with it is pretty satisfying to see the end result of, and the world is kind of bland, not right homeable about, but because the city is kind of bland, but the platforming and orbs for upgrading are structured all around it, I've actually explored more of the world than I thought I would. And one thing I will say for the game was the world is kind of bland. The architecture is quite interesting. Something that's quite nice is how vital and interesting verticality is to the game. A big thing about the loop of Crackdown is how you upgrade yourself by finding these orbs, and your jump will get higher, your strength will get stronger, your health will get better. What the developers have done here that's quite clever is that's kind of allowed them to play with verticality to the extreme. You start off with buildings that are 0 floors and 1 floors, and that's about it. The highest thing you'll climb is maybe 3 or 4 floors if you're lucky and put in time. Today I climbed a building that's like 25 floors and felt like I was at the top of the world for doing so. I'd not actually upgraded to the point where you should be able to do that yet. I kind of cheated my way around it a bit, but because I was doing that, I felt like I could fall off it and die at any point. It has a real impact, like minute to minute. You really feel like you're upgrading yourself and the changes you make. And whilst the game is not going to take home any Game of the Year awards, it's certainly not going to be up for anything. It's arguably not even the game of the day it released. I think there's a lot of fun to be had here, and I must say that sometimes turning off the dialogue, putting on Spotify in the background and just causing mayhem or driving about in a video game, sometimes that's what you want a game for. If you're looking for the equivalent of a popcorn flick, I kind of think you can't go wrong with Crackdown, although that is based on the first 15 hours. If the game is like 50 hours long, yeah, I could see it getting pretty repetitive. But not bad repetitive, just not amazing repetitive. Far Cry arguably came out to a similar response. There was a lot of potential for story scope with Far Cry, and it seems like it generally hasn't been hugely capitalised on. Also, the general consensus is if you haven't played Far Cry 5, you're not going to get quite as much out of New Dawn as you might think. Now, that seems fair to say because it's a sequel, but we didn't know quite how sequel-y it would be. We didn't know if it would play very, very hugely on those story threads that ended Far Cry 5, or just kind of let them be the framing for a new game. Well, it seems like it trades pretty heavily on it, using some of the characters and locations you experienced in the first one, Far Cry 5, that being. So it seems like you need to invest your time in 2 games to get something out of Far Cry New Dawn. If you already have in 5, you might get more out of it. If you haven't already, 5 seems like it's going to be the one to go to. There's a criticism of New Dawn that the gameplay systems haven't really changed much or evolved or done much to them. This is Far Cry as you know it. You will be scouting outposts, taking people out silently, trying to avoid being found, and when you're found, take part in gun battles. There's no towers like there used to be, but there weren't towers in 5 either. And so for that reason, Far Cry 5 arguably receives a similar kind of repetitive criticism from people. If you played 5... I meant New Dawn earlier, sorry. If you played 5, this is much the same with a slightly different story that doesn't quite capitalise on its ability to jump off of what Far Cry 5 gave us. And if you haven't played 5, well, you've probably played 4 or Primal or 3. If you haven't played any of those, these are great games to jump into. And even if you have, they're still pretty good games to jump into. The core loop of Far Cry is still very good, but it hasn't broken its own mould in a while, and you probably shouldn't be expecting New Dawn to do that anytime soon. The next release for the day was Jump Force. Now, Jump Force was one of those games that could go one way or another. It was either going to be a fantastic fighting game with a brand new set of characters that haven't appeared in fighting games before like this, that could arguably be setting up a new franchise or kind of making waves in the way the fighting game hasn't before, or it was going to kind of turn up, not raise any particular eyebrows. The people who love those characters will be interested and go in on it, but generally the kind of fighting game community will let it pass. And it seems like Jump Force is more the second than the first one. I actually haven't heard a lot of community response about Jump Force, which is probably a worse sign than if you had. At least with Far Cry and Crackdown, people are playing them enough to say, this is great or this is terrible. With Jump Force, I haven't really heard anything, to be honest. Generally, from the reviews, it seems like Jump Force is a fine game to play a little bit, but the more you try and master it, the more you see the problems of balance that are available in the base version of the game. Now, balance can be changed. In fact, balance changes kind of are the bread and butter of video games these days, especially live service games. So if Jump Force gains much of a community and the developers continue to support it, which we hope they do, expect to see that change and maybe Jump Force gain a bit of a life beyond its current iteration. But at its current iteration, it seems like it's a game for people who are into those characters, into the idea of playing a game like this, but probably not fighting game masters. Also, apparently load times are pretty egregious, which is, I suppose, fair enough considering it's quite a graphically intense game, but not fair enough when you're trying to play like live matches or get out of lobbies for an actual game of the thing. That can be quite tedious. So despite all its controversy on the PC side, and I say controversy very lightly because frankly it was more wine than controversy, Metro Exodus seems to be the game that came out of February the 15th the most successful. Its review scores are the highest, being around 75 to 80% depending on which platform you're looking at. And generally, the consumer response is roughly the same, noting that the game is good at what it does. For the most part, reviews state that this is a kind of evolution of the games, which is what you expect considering how big the scope changes from the previous Metro games. This is much less claustrophobic, much less sort of quiet and underground and dark. They've upped the scale of this game considerably, and that does apparently, according to the kind of general consensus of reviews, cause some technical issues as well. It could do with being a little bit more stable and a little bit more reliable in that sense. But if you can overlook these things, or you've been to the Metro games before and want to see where they go now, the general consensus is you'll be surprised by its ability to handle a change in scope, even though it doesn't quite perfect the formula, and maybe story has something to do with that. In terms of sales, in the UK at least, initial reports are that Far Cry New Dawn is the game that's coming out of this kind of massive amount of releases of games with the best sales, although Metro seems to have had more growth than the previous outings for the franchise, which is both a good thing, and let's be frank, we want all these games to sell well. We like it when developers succeed. But there you go. Those are our sort of wrap-up and round-up in response to all of the reactions to the big releases from February the 15th. There were a lot of games that came out that day, and not one of them really took the crown as the best game of the day. Metro is arguably the contender for it, but it didn't exactly run away with it, and the others are doing fine for their mediocrity within their communities. The people who care about them really care and are really enjoying them, and the people who don't are a lot more mixed on them. Seems like an obvious thing to say it, but it's still not what we expected coming out of the day. So that, ladies and gentlemen, was a wrap-up of that day, and I don't know, maybe if you're planning to buy one of the games that came up that day, a little way to help you decide which one you go for, or just a way to wrap up all the stuff that was said coming out of that day. Thanks very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, feel free to like and follow it on all the places that we are. They are in the description below. You should go to World Geekly News. It's real cool. It's run by real nice people. They do real good stuff, and we will see you next week for the next episode of this show. Until then, the game's out.